Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's discussion of Slay the Dragon and a candidate fundraiser for Sister District. My name is Lala Wu. I'm one of the co-founders of Sister District and the Director of Engagement and Partnerships. Before we get into our fantastic program tonight, I want to tell you a little bit about who Sister District is and what we do and why we're so excited to bring you this panel tonight. So Sister District is a grassroots organization with over 45,000 members across the country. And what we do is we harness the abundance of volunteer and donor energy, and we redirect it to critical swing districts in key states where we know that our support can mean the difference between a win or a loss. We do this by organizing our volunteers into over 150 active teams and affiliates, and then we sister them with 2 to 4 state legislative races per year for support. Our volunteers then raise money, make phone calls, write postcards, and more, all to support their candidates. This year alone, we've raised over $630,000 and made over 83,000 phone calls in support of these great candidates. We have an exclusive focus on state legislative races for several reasons, but one of the most important and urgent of them is gerrymandering. That's why we're so excited to bring you this panel tonight to talk about gerrymandering and redistricting using the fantastic documentary Slay the Dragon as a basis for our discussion. So don't worry if you haven't watched the movie, you're still in the right place, and this will still be a great discussion. But you can rent it and watch it using the link that will be dropped into the chat momentarily. And also, one more thing before we jump in, that this is a fundraiser for 10 of our sister district candidates where your money will go the furthest right now. So thank you to all of those who have already made a donation. And if you haven't yet already, or if you'd like to consider donating more, we'd really encourage you to do so using the link that is also going to be in the chat in just a second. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our wonderful panelists tonight. First, we've got Virginia Delegate Jennifer Carroll Foy. She is a Sister District alum who we were proud to support in 2017, and she is also running for governor of Virginia. She was one of the first African-American women to graduate from the Virginia Military Institute. She was also a foster mom, a magistrate judge, and a public defender. During her time in the legislature, Delegate Carroll Foy has led Virginia's effort to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. She has passed legislation to combat Virginia's teacher shortage and helped to expand Medicaid to over 400,000 Virginians. Next, we've got Dave Daley. He's the author of Ratf, which brought the story of Republican gerrymandering into the mainstream. He also recently wrote Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Slate, New York Magazine, and The Washington Post. Is a senior fellow at the electoral reform organization Fair Vote, as well as having been a former editor-in-chief of Salon. His gerrymandering expertise really is unparalleled, and we're thrilled to have him on the panel today. Next, we've got Sam Wang, who's both an accomplished neuroscientist at Princeton, as well as the founder of the Princeton Election Consortium and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. His political work includes pioneering statistical methods for analyzing the US presidential elections and developing tools for aggregating state polls. The Princeton Gerrymandering Project conducts analysis to better understand and eliminate partisan gerrymandering at the state-by-state level. And last but certainly not least, we've got Meaghan Winter, who is a journalist whose work has appeared in New York Magazine, Essence, the New York Times, Slate, excuse me, and more. Her first book, All Politics is Local, Why Progressives Must Fight for the States, was published last fall. It is a fantastic read, as well as Dave's books, Ratf and Unrigged. Really encourage you to pick them both up for a deeper dive into why states matter. So with those introductions, I know that you're really here to learn more from our panelists, and I'm excited to jump in. So Dave, let's start with you. You literally wrote the book on gerrymandering with Ratf, and this is the book that was upon which the movie Slay the Dragon was based, and you played a major role in bringing this movie to life. So let's start with the title. Why is the movie called Slay the Dragon, and what exactly is gerrymandering?
It's just nice not to be asked about the title of Ratf for a change. Thank you for putting this together, and it's a thrill to be on this with all of you, such esteemed and impressive panelists. So thank you. And this is a lake house in New Hampshire. This is not where I actually live. The movie is called Slay the Dragon because it is about trying to put an end to these districts that are drawn to look like pterodactyls and dragons and Donald Duck kicking Goofy in such a way that it twists our democracy. These district lines are really the building blocks of our democracy. And when they are twisted by partisans in such a way as to give themselves advantage, it distorts the very essence of a representative democracy itself. The movie could have been called Slay the Salamander, although that is not a very exciting name. Perhaps it's not as difficult to slay a salamander, but really, when you take it back to the very beginning of this, I mean, you can trace a gerrymandering back as long as we've had politicians. I mean, Patrick Henry tries to gerrymander James Madison out of the very first Congress down in Delegate Carroll Foy's home state of Virginia, way back in the 1780s. So this has been with us for a long time. It takes its name from Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, whose party in 1812 tries to draw state legislative districts, Senate districts around Boston, and a political cartoonist says that they look like a salamander, so it becomes known as the gerrymander. Over the years, not much has changed in many ways, except for the fact that politicians now are able to draw districts in such precise and specific and sophisticated ways, using exacting data, using really precise computerized mapping software, and it allows the party that's in charge of this process to draw themselves advantages that, as we have seen throughout 2010, can stretch for an entire decade and can be a firewall between the people and the vote. What you have seen across the course of this last decade is that we've become increasingly an anti-majoritarian nation in all of these states. A majority of votes are cast for Democrats, but because of the way the district lines are drawn, gerrymandering, what you have are continued Republican majorities in state after state, which are then free to pass all the kinds of extreme legislation that they'd like, that are free to add all kinds of additional voter suppression measures that add additional barriers between people in the ballot box. Gerrymandering is fundamentally cheating. It is the art and increasingly the dark science of trying to put the other side's votes into as few districts as possible while you give yourself all of the ones around it. It's one of the big reasons for the mess we're in right now.
Thank you for that explanation. It's really helpful. And so now that we've got a little bit of a basic understanding of how gerrymandering works, would love to dive a little bit deeper. So Sam, I would love for you to talk a bit about how exactly gerrymandering disenfranchises voters. You know, and put another way, how does it contort our understanding of the principle one person, one vote?
Well, the fundamental act of gerrymandering is that politicians pick their voters and arrange them the way they like to make their own offices quite safe for themselves. And so, as Dave Daley says, we've had gerrymandering for several hundred years. The United States has worse gerrymandering problems than any other democracy in the world. It's remarkable. In a survey of experts, we're dead last out of 54 democracies. And the way this is done is by simply knowing your voters and then picking them and then swapping them with neighboring districts to create safe wins. So let's say if you're trying to entrap members of the other party, you pack them in as few districts as possible so they have very few wins. If you're trying to target a minority group, then you have several choices. A minority group can either be trapped in a few districts, packed into as few as possible. That happened in Virginia and southeastern Virginia a few years ago in the last decade. Or you can take a community and draw a line right down the middle. So just like putting a superhighway down a community, you can draw a line down a community and divide them as surely as you would divide a community with a superhighway. These things are easier and easier to do with granular data. My group at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project uses data to try to put that same information into the hands of citizens. This is a process that until now has very much been in the hands of legislators, done behind closed doors, and it is a very hard temptation for any elected official to avoid. It is just so tempting every 10 years to say, you know, I'd like to draw a line that keeps myself in power. I like those voters over there. I don't like those over there so much. It's a way in which we are separated from our elected officials by these lines that they draw to keep us out. Gated communities for voters.
Thank you for that. That's a really helpful additional digging in of what gerrymandering is. And so I think it is really plain that gerrymandering just strikes us at a fundamental level as unfair. But we don't simply care about it because we like the color red or the color blue. It matters because of the real impact that this has on people's lives. So Slay the Dragon, the movie, opens by connecting the dots between gerrymandering and something that at first glance seems unrelated, the Flint water crisis, which Dave also describes in his new book, Unrigged. There in Michigan, the Republican legislature had passed an emergency manager law that allowed the state to dictatorially take over municipalities. It was so incredibly unpopular that people voted to repeal it. But the Republicans, knowing that they were insulated, incredibly safe because of their gerrymandered districts, they were unaccountable. They overruled the will of the people and reinstated the law that had just been gotten rid of by the people's vote. So after doing this, the Republicans installed so-called emergency district managers, and one of these officials switched the water source from the Detroit water source to the contaminated Flint River. And as a result, there has been an incredible tragedy that I don't need to recount here, but that the people of Flint are still living with that lead contamination and those horrific outcomes today. So, you know, that was, I thought, a really powerful example of how this gerrymandering has real world outcomes and impacts on people's lives. So my next question is for Delegate Carroll Foy. You're a delegate in Virginia, which, as we've discussed already a little bit, has suffered in the past from severe gerrymandering. What are some of the ways that you've seen gerrymandering and unfair representation hurt the people in your state?
Absolutely, thank you for that question. And so at the essence of everything, I have to say, gerrymandering has been executed with a matter of precision here in the Commonwealth. That is absolutely excellent. We've had Democrats in power for the past 10 years. However, Republicans have been able to maintain a stronghold in General Assembly until most recently, when the courts stated unequivocally that 11 of the districts in Virginia was definitely racially gerrymandered, and the districts had to be redrawn. And when that was done, that's when we had a different outcome. And Democrats were able to take the trifecta here in Virginia, passing some of the most progressive, bold, and life-altering legislation that Virginia has ever seen, making access to the ballot easier, and women's reproductive health care, passing common sense gun safety legislation. The will of the people is actually being executed here in Virginia, and that's what happens when you end gerrymandering. So one of the most egregious things that I have seen that many people don't talk about is the fact that in Virginia, the legislators pick who the judges are of the most powerful courts. And so when you have the disenfranchisement of so many Virginians, and their will isn't executed and their voice isn't heard because their ballot doesn't matter at the voting booth, then you have Republicans putting some of the most conservative judges on the highest courts in the Commonwealth. And that results in the undermining of a lot of the legislators who are elected to get things done. And you see the undoing and the unraveling of that. And so that's a problem. So racial gerrymandering or gerrymandering in general, it's not only dangerous because you're diluting the vote, but also because you're diluting the will of the people. And the will of the people isn't being adhered to. And so once you see these things play out, I mean, even most recently in Virginia, we're removing a lot of the symbols of the Confederacy, like a lot of the statutes. And now you have conservative and Republican appointed judges putting injunctions in place. Even though, again, the majority was just one here. And you would think that Virginia should be on the right side of history for once. And the voices of so many people have been heard. But then again, you have a court who's steadily trying to undo it. And you look at who's been appointing those judges for the last over several decades, and that's what you end up with. So it's important. This issue is important because at the core of our American democracy is the belief that the people should elect the leaders who will give a voice to their values. And that wasn't happening here in Virginia. And even though the right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy, I mean, just partisan politics has just played such a huge role in redistricting that you can't ignore it. And let me be clear. Democrats have gerrymandered just as well as Republicans have. And a lot of people don't like to hear that, but that is absolutely true. And that is why I support a third-party, nonpartisan commission to draw the lines, because it is very enticing to draw lines that will keep you on power for the next several decades to come. But again, the disastrous effects of it is still being felt here in Virginia. And for me, I think one of the most profound isn't only the legislation that isn't passed because the right people aren't in power, but also because of the conservative judges that are appointed who ensure that the Republican will is executed.
Thank you for that. Could not agree more about the importance of a fair judiciary, and really, can be really alarming to think about the wide-ranging impacts that all of that has. So really appreciate that. Thank you. Meaghan, I'd like to turn to you next and to talk a little bit more about the impacts of gerrymandering, what that has on people's lives. So one of the states that you do a deep dive into in your book, All Politics is Local, is Florida. And you draw a connection between Republicans' protected gerrymandered seats and some horrific policy outcomes. So I'm wondering if you could please talk a little bit more about your example there.
Sure, it's really nice to be here. So thanks for everyone who is tuning in. I'm so glad Delegate Carroll Foy brought up the courts, and I can feel my blood boiling, and I'm gonna try to stay on the topic that I was gonna talk about now, but I wanna return to that later because it's so important. So Florida, I chose that state to write about in the book because, as we all know, it's one of the states that I write about. As we all know, Florida is this major swing state. Every national election, it's like, which way is it going to go? But if you look at their state assembly and Senate, the Republicans have had a lock on it. And why is that? Because of what Dave described in his book about the red map and long-term, very concentrated efforts by Republicans to gerrymander in not so subtle ways. And so there have been numerous consequences of that. And I thought in the book I write mostly about, or primarily about, climate, which of course is a public health issue also, but I thought given everything going on, I would just talk about a couple quick things about health in general. So one consequence of this for Floridians is Florida has not expanded Medicaid. So that means if you're a low income worker, you are oftentimes uninsured. There's at least 500,000 uninsured Floridians currently working who don't have access to health insurance because they don't make enough to pay for it themselves, and they make too much to be covered by the state. So it's a major problem. It's a major problem, especially given what's going on. And polls of Floridians have shown that something like 70% of them want to see the state expand Medicaid. So again, as Delegate Carroll Foy was saying, the will of the people is not being expressed and their public interest is not being taken care of. And it's not abstract now to see how an individual's health is also connected to the health of the community. We all get that now, right? So there's that. And then connected to that is this idea of preemption laws. And preemption laws are passed all over the country. And this is something that's really also important is community organizers across the state were trying to pass paid sick leave. And in Orlando, they did. The city council passed paid sick leave. The state, the Republican-led Assembly and Senate then immediately passed a preemption law preventing cities from having paid sick leave policies. So that means these people who put in all this energy to be able to have a paid sick day, that win is taken from them. And those kinds of preemption laws are passed by state assemblies across the country. Missouri organizers in St. Louis and Kansas City raised the minimum wage in their cities after years of organizing, hitting the pavement, doing all the work that we know goes into trying to better people's lives. And the state then passed a preemption law preventing the minimum wage from being increased. So those are just a couple ways that are really, like in a really concrete way, people are being denied access to, you know, a better standard of living, really, and that then, you know, because of the actions of these lawmakers. And I also wanted to make the point, which is probably obvious to all of us here, but I just think it should be made explicit, that because of all the things we're describing, working to end gerrymandering and working on the state level is inherently anti-racist work, right? Because so many of these things are vestiges of the Jim Crow era. So many of these things, for example, the laws I just described about minimum wage or paid sick leave or Medicaid, disproportionately affect people of color, you know. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind as we're all, you know, thinking about these things in front and center every day, that joining these kinds of efforts to end gerrymandering is anti-racist work. And that is yet another reason that it's so important.
Thank you for that, Meaghan. And I would love to open it up since you raised that. You know, we are in the midst of a pandemic, of course, and still feeling the reverberations of massive protests in response to George Floyd's murder and against structural racism and against police brutality. I'd love for, anyone who would like to respond, how do these contexts change our understanding of gerrymandering and its impacts, or how does it maybe bring these into sharper relief?
59 million Americans live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature are controlled by the party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election. 33 Americans were purged from the voting rolls, according to the Brennan Center, between 2014 and 2018. Thousands of polling places across the country have been shuttered since the Supreme Court's horrific decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. Voter ID bills in 25 states since 2011. All of this disproportionately affecting communities of color, disproportionately affecting young people, putting up barriers to the vote, making votes not matter as much. And when you consistently make votes not matter like this, when you lock in this kind of anti-majoritarianism and make it impossible for a majority of people to create the kind of change that they want, the end result is people have nowhere to go but the streets to make their voices heard.
I see democracy as a leaky pipe where there are all these things that are needed for us to be able to influence and reach our legislators. Registering to vote, being allowed to go vote, having our ballots accepted for counting. All these things happen, getting a fair census count. Gerrymandering is weird because it's technical, it's obscure, it's a part of that pipe that has the biggest leaks of all. And until a few years ago, many people weren't thinking about it. A bad redistricting map can have effects on representation that are 3 times as large as even the worst undercount in a census. By far, gerrymandering is the step that has the most effects, and we are rightly angry about all these steps, but gerrymandering gets you you can get all the way to the finish line, and then when you're about to cross the finish line, then a big hand comes up and says, your vote doesn't count. And so, of course, as Dave says, people are angry. And so strengthening and rebuilding democracy requires fighting all of these offenses and making sure that you as citizens can make it all the way to the finish line. And that's a big struggle of our time.
For me, I think that it's good when people are protesting peacefully for a purpose. And we all had to be still because we're sheltered in place and watch as a man slowly lose his life for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This is something that you cannot unsee. And I think we will forever be changed because of it. And now the question is, well, what are you going to do about it? So I tell people that the way I protest is through passing policies that's going to dismantle the systemic historical inequities embedded in so many of our systems. I mean, you can go back in relation to gerrymandering as far as a few decades after the Civil War, and you look at redlining, and you see a very similar effect where African Americans have been locked out of wealth development, of generational legacy wealth development, because of the fact that they did not have access to the loans or allowed into communities where they could build one of the most traditional ways to build wealth, which is land ownership, property ownership. So it goes further back than the false promise of 40 acres and a mule. We're talking about the gerrymandered way of doing things, which is redlining. And you also see it currently today, where we even have today's version of redlining, where we have the underfunding and equitable funding of schools, which cause modern day segregation, because the first thing that families do when they have children is they look for the best schools. And the best schools are oftentimes the most affluent communities because our schools are driven by property taxes. And so when you look at African Americans and how they've been boxed out, and how many of them don't have the economic opportunities that many other communities have had, you have brown and Black communities segregated to one segment of a city or a county in underfunded schools because of lack of property taxes. And then you have the more affluent kids who are oftentimes white going to better schools. And so that's the modern day version of gerrymandering. So you see it on so many facets, and it's every day, everywhere that we look. And even the impacts of COVID-19, you see the inequities and the health disparities. African Americans and Latinx communities have higher contraction and mortality rates. And again, it's because of the food deserts that's in a lot of the communities of color that's already been segregated due to gerrymandering and housing. And also in the inability for some communities to have Medicaid expansion so more people can have access to affordable health care. It goes back so far, and all of these things can be traced to some form or fashion of gerrymandering because it's one of the most effective ways to disenfranchise a large population of people.
Thank you. That was really beautifully said, and I think so helpful for contextualizing this very nerdy, seemingly technical issue in a broader context, right? Like, what is it that we're all doing here, and why are we doing it? So, you know, with that kind of grounding, I want to dive back into the weeds a little bit and talk about how, you know, these Republican gerrymanders and the subsequent extreme policies that they're implemented in individual states, right? They're state by state, but they're not actually piecemeal, right? Like, it's not like their people are randomly out there coming up with these things on their own. Dave, this next question is for you. The movie traces the story you broke in Ratf about Red Map, which is called the Redistricting Majority Project, where Republicans basically moneyballed state legislatures to win back power. And then once the power was won, ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, lots of acronyms today, engaged in a highly targeted and strategic campaign to advance extreme policy. I'd love if you could just dive into that a little bit and kind of explain the mechanics of this Republican machine.
Sure. I think the best way to think about this in some ways is as a story of two elections. It's a story of 2008 and it's a story of 2010. 2008, the nation elects Barack Obama, our first Black president. The Democrats win a supermajority in the US Senate and take a renewed majority in the US House. Democrats expand their advantages in state legislatures and governorships across the country. You go back and look at the news coverage of that night, folks are talking about how the Republicans were going to be a minority party in this nation for a generation to come because of the way that the demographics of the country were changing. And it didn't exactly turn out that way, did it? And that's because there's a handful of really sophisticated Republican operatives who understand that as historic as 2008 was, 2010 had the ability to be that much more consequential. 2010 was a census year, which means redistricting follows the census. So if they could, and in most places, state legislatures draw all of these lines for themselves and also for the congressional districts. So Republicans had, a light bulb moment, and they said, well, what happens if we try to sit down and control every single seat at the table in as many states as we possibly can, especially swing states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, states that are going to be gaining or losing seats because of reapportionment that follows the census as well. And what they realize is what all of you at Sister District realize, that all of this begins at the state legislative basis. So for $30 million, not a lot of money, a pittance in American politics, really. You can't even lose a small state, a US Senate race, or those kinds of dollars. They invest in these local races around the country, small legislative races in all of these states. They essentially drown these Democratic incumbents who didn't see this coming in the last 6 weeks of the campaign in a flood of negative ads. They win. 2010 is a big Republican year. It's a big wave year. It's a Tea Party year. It's kind of the anti-Obama backlash year. It's the Affordable Care Act backlash year. But it's such an effective year for Republicans, not because of the big wins they had, not because of the 700 state legislative seats that they picked up, but because of the 117 specific targeted state legislative races in 16 states that allowed them to completely control a redistricting in all of these states, remap all of them the following year. Democrats have not won back a chamber in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Florida. Any of these states, it hasn't happened for 10 years. Red Map has defined the last decade of our politics. We're in a redistricting year again now. It's about to become that important again. And all you have to do is look at what happened then in 2012, if you want to make it a story of 3 elections. In 2012, Barack Obama is reelected. Democrats win 1.4 million more votes at the US House level. We don't elect the US House by national popular vote. We don't elect much of anything by national popular vote. But this is still very rare. Republicans hold a 234-201 advantage there. In state after state, in Michigan, it's a 9-5 congressional delegation for the Republicans, even though Democrats won 250,000 more votes. In Pennsylvania, 13-5 is the delegation, despite 100,000 more votes for Democratic candidates. You can go on and on and on. That is the impact of these lines.
Thank you, Dave. And so now that I think we've got, hopefully everybody here feels a little bit more comfortable or uncomfortable with how unfair gerrymandering is, the connection between Republican gerrymandering and extreme policy, and the ways that this really disenfranchises voters and really impacts people's lives. I want to shift the conversation to talk a little bit about some solutions. I'd actually like to start with Sam. And in Wisconsin, Slay the Dragon in the documentary talks about how the Republicans there, after they swept the legislature in 2010, engaged in a deeply secretive process that involved written pledges to confidentiality and other shady practices. And it would eventually take a 3-judge federal court panel to pry some of these secrets out of them. So if you could talk a little bit about why was that secrecy so damaging, and why is it what's the importance of data transparency, to building some solutions out of this?
I will say that drawing a fair map that represents all communities is a challenge, but in some ways it's not that hard, because the kinds of things it requires are everybody having the data. everybody seeing what's going on, everybody having a voice at the table. And in some ways, even though that's a difficult process, it's an open process. Drawing an unfair map that keeps your own side in power, or that, as in Wisconsin, allows less than half the votes to elect over 60 out of 99 legislators, that's a technical challenge that requires you to work quietly with your cup of coffee in front of your computer, drawing lines just right to take your digital X-Acto blade and cut out a district. And that's technically challenging and best done behind closed doors. And so at some level, drawing fair districts is best done when everything's out in the open. And so when data's out in the open, as we do at the Gerrymandering Project at openprecincts.org, when communities weigh in, as we do with our project at representable.org, citizens can weigh in. And one of the big challenges is, in that case that you mentioned, federal courts aren't going to take care of us. The Supreme Court decided not to intervene, even though there was plenty of math given to them to define it as rigorously as you would define a 1 pound block of chocolate. They just didn't want that scale. And so it's left to us to do it state by state. And so every state has to do it differently. In Wisconsin, it's going to be done by finally having split control of districting because of a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. In Virginia, the likeliest route is going to be through an independent commission and combined with politicians. There could be more legal safeguards there to protect diverse communities in Virginia. Every state's different. Every state has its own needs. And so we're just going to have to find ways around it. And we're going to have to discover our inner federalist. And I think Meaghan is an expert on taking the local route.
Yes, that's exactly right. And just discovering our inner federalist is something that we talk about a lot here at Sister District, certainly, where, I'm a former attorney, and so courts are important. Litigation is an important strategy. But look, especially with Kavanaugh's appointment, the Supreme Court is not going to save us. Federal courts, which are now packed with Trump appointees, are not going to save us. There are these institutions that we have held so highly in our minds as these stopgaps, these protectors of our society, and we can't rely on them in that way anymore. We have to turn to the states. We have to look to the states to lead us out of this mess state by state. So, Sam, you mentioned independent redistricting commissions, and I just want to spend a few minutes talking a bit about those. Anybody who'd like to answer this is free to actually, but would love to hear, the Independent Redistricting Commission essentially is a body that will be in charge of redrawing the district lines each 10 years. And that is as distinguished from a system where state legislators do that. But they're not a panacea. There are some differences. There are some protections that need to be in place. And there's ways to build these independent redistricting commissions so that they are actually get the fair results that we want. So I'd love to hear from any of you about what some of these considerations are.
Well, if it's okay with me to go, these commissions, if they have a voting rule that involves independent commissioners, if they have a voting rule that requires a supermajority to pass a plan so that members of, say, both the independent, Democratic, and Republican groups all have to vote to pass a plan, that's the rule in California. And the Republican commissioners in California report that even though they didn't always agree with the outcome, I've spoken with commissioners in California, one commissioner who said that she absolutely had faith in the process because she had a seat at the table, because there was public input. And so there are ways to ensure that everybody has input. There are ways to pass criteria into law in California, in Arizona, in Michigan, in Colorado. The laws there have criteria that say don't favor a particular party, don't favor or disfavor incumbents, make sure that diverse communities of interest are represented. And those criteria bills when they become law can protect. So it's a combination of a process involving people and criteria that a court can evaluate fairly. You have to write those laws pretty carefully because state courts aren't always sympathetic to voting rights. I would personally love to litigate a fairness claim in North Carolina. I would be a little bit less in love with doing it in, say, Virginia at the moment, but that can change. Wisconsin Maybe, maybe not. Florida, no. And so one has to know all these details of strategery to know how to get these things to go. And I think that not just commissions, but also fairness criteria. And also finally, public input at public hearings, where people should be able to rise up and give their input and say what they think. So it's a big prickly problem, and it takes everybody pitching in.
I would say one of the problems that we have here in Virginia is that we have a constitutional amendment that is going to go for referendum to the people this November, but it was drafted by Republicans when they were in power before the Democratic swing that happened last year. And so our constitutional amendment has to be passed 2 times by the General Assembly. And what's going to go to the people in and of itself, it's basically kind of codifying bipartisan redistricting in a real way. It allows for 8 citizens, but 8 legislators, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. The legislators get to pick who's on it, and if they can't come to an agreement, it goes before the Supreme Court. And as many people who are familiar with Virginia politics know, that when our elections are dependent upon the courts here in Virginia, we don't fare as well. I.e. Shelley Simon, where she actually lost her race because of a name pulled out of a bowl. And i.e. Josh Cole, because of split districts, he lost by something like 87 votes, but over 146 people were given the wrong ballot without his name on it. And so those elections didn't go well. And, you know, I don't have to tell you that these were Republican conservative judges that were appointed that made these decisions. So that's what's on the line. And the thing about enabling legislation, while it's needed, especially when you have constitutional amendment, the problem is it can be changed depending upon who's in power. And oftentimes you have people not agreeing that putting the language in enabling legislation that you shall not gerrymander was contentious. Putting in there that we have to have a process where the citizens, there's an open application process, and we have to look at diversity of socioeconomic status, race, gender, all of these things, but not political affiliation. That was contentious. So I always stand true that there should be a independent third-party commission, nonpartisan commission that draws these lines to take the temptation away from the legislators and the people who have a stake in the process being a part of the process and making the decisions about who are the next people to be in power for the next 10, 20, 40 years from now, because the implications are great and grave. And there's a chilling effect that's happening because people feel as if their vote and therefore their voice isn't heard and it doesn't matter. And that is very dangerous. So that's what's happening here in Virginia. So it'll go to the people here in November. We'll see what happens. It's going to make our elections in 2021 even more interesting now that the census has a delay. And it looks like our June primary could be pushed back as late as almost August or September, especially with these redistricting commission that, you know, if it goes through. So it's going to be a very interesting year. All eyes are going to be on Virginia.
Delegate Carroll Foy, I'm super fascinated by all these things happening in your state and your close-up view of it. You're critical about enabling legislation, but let's say this constitutional amendment passes. How would you feel at that point about making it stronger, at least for the next cycle, with enabling legislation? Is that the kind of thing that you might be open to at least get some kind of seatbelt in place, at least for one cycle?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The griping is actually about the fact that we weren't able to get all the protections that I was hoping we were able to get put in the legislation.
Right, because it was stripped down in order to get the Republicans themselves on board. And so my take on that was that they were afraid of losing power and they thought they'd get something that gives them some amount of guarantee that they weren't going to get taken to the cleaners by Democrats.
And there you
go. But they left some key protections out, and I guess that's the missing thing at the moment.
That's right. And then even in the protections, it says like the lines to be drawn in accordance with the Voting Rights Act. And as we all know, you know, a huge provision of the Voting Rights Act, you know, has been repealed. It's been rescinded. And so, and so when you have legislation that depends upon other legislation that may be good on a Monday, but changes altogether on Friday, then you really have an issue. So it's those type of things that I think we could have definitely done better and worked out. Of course, my ideal didn't happen. And the next best thing is to get the strongest enabler legislation that we can possibly get done.
Thank you so much for that. That's awesome. And so what I want to do now actually is open it up for questions. I see that folks have been asking questions there's a Q&A function in Zoom. And Sam has, as true to form, really good at multitasking and has been answering some of those questions. So feel free to pop into the Q&A. Should be a little button at the bottom of your screen to check out those questions and answers. And you can also feel free to ask questions in the chat. So I'm going to pick up one of the questions that I've already seen so far, and it is from a messaging standpoint, how do organizers overcome that seemingly technical, not as glamorous aspect of gerrymandering to make it an issue for voters at the polls? So maybe Meaghan, I'd love to hear, your thoughts having talked to folks about, the different kinds of movements that they have started and have worked on. How do we get over this hurdle?
Yeah, I think this is a huge issue, especially with redistricting and gerrymandering, and frankly, with a lot of local law in general, either on the city or state level, because so much of it is by design made to seem complicated and made to keep the public out. And again, I want to emphasize that that's not just like a happenstance. A lot of these things, a lot of like libertarian operatives and corporate operatives decided that they were going to lobby on the state level because a lot of this minutia was going to be it was going to seem too arcane for the public to follow along. That's the same thing with the anti-abortion strategy, right? It's incremental by design so that people don't think that something dramatic is happening when it is. So this is a major issue, right? And I think that something that Missouri organizers did I think it was 2018 that they passed a ballot initiative that did a number of things. It changed lobbying laws, it changed redistricting, and they built that as a Clean Missouri bill. And they talked a lot about fairness. They talked a lot about, they used clean, they used a lot of really basic, simple words that most Americans value, right? We value fairness. We value openness and transparency. So I think those kinds of basic values that many of us share and that everyone understands are really important to use, because most people don't care about the ins and outs of it, but most people do respond immediately to this idea of money in politics or basic fairness. And a huge number of Americans across the ideological spectrum want money out of politics. They want equal representation if it's billed to them that way. So I think speaking to people's general democratic values is really
Yeah, I mean, this November in Missouri, there's going to be an attempted repeal of the Clean Missouri legislation, Dirty Missouri. And it would be a good idea to vote against Dirty Missouri. So if you want your government clean, if you want it responsive to the voters, then it would be a great thing to get out the vote against the Dirty Missouri legislation. And so, why doesn't Flint have clean water? Why is it that you vote and vote and vote and people don't respond? What is going on? And in every state, one has to think of a message that really clicks with people.
People get it though. I mean, 2018, you had 5 states in which voters stepped up and fixed this, and it was hard work. I mean, what Katie Fahey and Voters Not Politicians had to do in Michigan, they had to beat back the Chamber of Commerce. They had to beat back the state Republican Party. They had to beat back, groups funded by the Koch brothers. And they were just average citizens who got fed up with gerrymandering in their state and how anti-democratic it made it. And they had to learn how to write a proposal, how to do a petition drive. And they got 430,000 signatures, and they got this on the ballot. And in a state in which 61% of people don't agree on much of anything, they won. Missouri won with over 60% of the vote. It won in Ohio and Colorado at over 70% of the vote. It won in Utah with just over 50% of the vote. When you present this to Americans, red state, blue state, purple state, we all hate gerrymandering.
That is absolutely right. It was incredible to see that wave of ballot initiatives that that passed in 2018, implementing independent redistricting commissions. So just taking another question from the chat. Let's see here. So this is a bit of a technical question. Is curious if anybody has any insights on it. But what about in California creating a presumption that would basically mean that create more transparency, where the information, it's the state and local government agencies should be posted on the web in real time. Essentially, I think that this could be applied to other states as well. I think this concept is, I think the question, you know, is getting at what could we do to create some more transparency, and how would this help?
Well, I think that data transparency legislation is sometimes, depending on what domain it is, I mean, campaign finance is a little touchy, but other kinds of data transparency are kind of nerdy and obscure. And for the same reason that gerrymandering is not very glamorous, data transparency kind of puts people to sleep. You can get it passed accidentally. Here in New Jersey, we advocated for an election data transparency bill, and it passed unanimously in the closing hours of the legislative session. I think partly because the legislators didn't really, I wouldn't say they didn't understand it, but they thought it seemed kind of technical. And guess what? We're gonna get precinct and election data, and it makes it way easier for citizens to see what's going on. So, so I think that there are ways to advocate for these things. I think the state legislators are often looking to make a mark, and there's just so many things in state government. You find a friendly legislator who, you know, is thinking about things, introduces a bill. It feels to me like there's a lot of opportunity to make a difference at a state level. I found state legislators to be far more responsive than members of Congress, and I'm not sure I've ever spoken with a senator. Years ago, but it's been a while. And so really local legislators, you know, they meet their constituents. I think that there is more hope for data transparency, maybe even in campaign finance, than you might expect.
Thanks so much for that. I couldn't agree more that state legislators are really, you know, the key to making so much of this reform happen. You know, we've talked about a number of different potential solutions, from more transparency to ballot initiatives that put independent redistricting commissions into the state's laws, as well as electing state legislators, right? Like, this is such a key component. I personally am a little bit biased because that's what we do here at Sister District, is that we look for these key states where we can, you know, we're trying to respond to what RedMap did in 2010, right? We're looking for these key states where if we win a few of them, and they don't necessarily cost that much money, but if we win them, we can take back control in these states, take back some power, and then we can help to beat back gerrymandering and draw fair district lines in 2021. So it really is a once in a decade proposition. And I really appreciate everybody's comments that kind of talk about the importance of what happens at the state level. I want to pull a question that was answered in the Q&A section, but I think is important to just talk a little bit about, which is somebody explained that they were horrified to learn about RedMap, and how did Republicans pull that off? What was going on with Democrats at the time?
Democrats fell asleep on it, pure and simple. And I mean, if you go back, if you Google Carl Rove, March 2010, Wall Street Journal, you can find Carl Rove's piece that lays out the entire plan, tells you where this is going to go down, the exact small towns in Pennsylvania and Indiana and Texas and Florida where they're going to do this and what the impact is going to be. Democrats fell asleep on it. In my new book, I spend some time with Eric Holder, who's now running the Democrats' response to this, but was Attorney General at the time. And I said, so when did you first learn about RedMap? And he said, well, and this story will horrify you. He said, I was at the White House and Barack Obama and I were looking over the numbers from 2012. And we couldn't understand why we didn't do better in all of these states. We couldn't figure out what had happened in North Carolina and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. It's like we won these states, but didn't make any impact in Congress or in state legislatures. They're like, what happened? And that's when they learned about RedMap. After November of 2012, 2 years later, when it was already way too late. And I mean, Obama's second term agenda was effectively dead in the water that night. And we got a very different House. And Obama had to sort of govern by executive action instead in that executive order. And as we've all seen, executive orders can get pretty quickly undone when another party comes in and takes control.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add to that and endorse why what Sister District does is so important. Is for, you know, the past 40 or so years, Democrats and progressives and liberals, whatever, however you want to frame them, have neglected state level work and have focused primarily on the national level. And that is, you know, a large part of this. And this is also connected to the courts in that, you know, Republicans, it's not by coincidence that Mitch McConnell has installed so many more federal judges. That has been designed for the past, you know, multiple decades. All of this has been, you know, they've been working on all of this. So, you know, what I would really recommend to people who are thinking like, okay, how can I help? And not to discourage you from giving to national organizations, because like, yes, do that, but give to whoever's running for state assembly in your district. Email their volunteer coordinator tomorrow and ask what you can do, or give $20 to an organization that is helping people running on the state level or on your city level, because that way these small amounts that you can give in terms of time or money really do have a bigger difference than, you know, whatever national organization is renting an empty DC office right now. So
thank you, Meaghan. And that's a really great segue. I'd love to go around really quickly, just around the horn, one sentence about what advice, as we wrap up, what advice you have for folks and how they can help to slay the dragon. Dave, why don't we start with you?
I'm going to say two sentences. One is be a poll worker, because we are going to need a robust in-person voting setup, and we're going to, if you are young, if you are healthy, if you can volunteer at the polls, do it. The second thing is don't look backward at 2010 only. The Republicans have got a plan for 2020 that is different. It involves citizen voting age population, involves redrawing districts based not on total population, but based on citizen population. This has to do with the citizenship question on the census. This is going to be the strategy in all of these states in 2021 moving forward. Be aware of citizen voting age population.
Thanks, Dave. Delegate Carroll Foy?
Yeah, let's say get involved. Make sure whether that is, you know, donating to candidates, not knocking doors, but helping with digital, doing postcards, whatever you can. I mean, what I like to tell people is what Trump does or the president does may not ever affect you, right? There's checks and balances. But whatever I do as a state delegate and as the future governor for Virginia will affect you on July 1st every single year. So make sure to get involved, and state politics and policies matter, and state campaigns matter. And so that's where the rubber meets the road. If you're worried about education, if you're worried about, you know, traffic, if you're worried about all of these things, the environment, that is a state level issue. So I just can't emphasize to people how important state elections mean. And now they determine what our politics will look like for the next decade. So thanks.
Thank you. Sam?
I think that we often see a lot of bad news about voter suppression and ways in which our franchise is threatened. But I just want to remind everyone that voters and citizens are mobilized this year like never before. We had the highest midterm turnout in a century in 2018. We had high turnout in Wisconsin despite coronavirus. We had high turnout in Kentucky despite coronavirus. Keeping vote by mail safe is possible and can lead to a result in which many, many people vote. And so I would say to people, they should be optimistic this year, because this is a year when change is possible. This is a year when voices can get heard. And it's a critical year because so many of these people we're electing are going to have control over redistricting. And so, especially in places that Sister District has identified, if you go over to gerrymander.princeton.edu, we've been working on this. We have our own Moneyball unit where we're trying to identify precisely which districts are the most valuable. I think there are so many ways to get involved with your voice, with your postcards, with your money. It's really an important year to not lose heart. And I think that if we can hang on and strengthen our democracy for the next 10 years, then there are much better times ahead with a lot of work.
Thank you, Sam. And Meaghan, you kind of answered this question already, but do you have any last closing thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Sam was saying and say, you know, after I reported the book, I missed the activists and the lawmakers that I'd, you know, spent time with, because I just want to say that people, as you can tell from this panel, the people who are involved in these issues tend to be very passionate, smart. Yeah, we can get wonky, but all for a good cause. So it's not that you should feel like some martyrdom by signing up to do these things. It really will enrich your life in whatever time you give. So that's my ending.
Thank you all so much. Really huge thank you to the panelists for being here. We're going to drop a link in the chat again to donate to our 10 candidates in key states who will fight back against gerrymandering and redraw district lines in 2021. Thank you so much for your attending tonight. I don't know if you all can't see because it's a webinar, but we had over 100 people sign up. Great attendance, really, really wonderful to connect with you all. So thank you. Please donate, check out the movie, check out the books, follow these wonderful panelists on Twitter and all the other places that you can find them. Really appreciate you all being here, and take care. Okay, good night.